Thanks for joining us. I'm Caroline Pearson from Avalere Health. I am the Senior Vice President of Policy and Strategy at Avalere, and we are a strategic advisory firm based in Washington, D.C. We work with stakeholders from across the healthcare system to solve complex business and policy problems. Today's session is entitled, Can We Afford to Cure Disease? And I think it is going to be as provocative of a discussion as it is a title. So I want to start off with a few framing comments, and if we can pull up slide 4. I wanted to start off with why are we talking about this today? Why at the 2016 Milken Conference are we talking about drug pricing? And so this graph gives you a sense of what the media coverage looks like historically for the issue of drug prices. And you can see way out on the right-hand side in 2015 where media mentions of prescription drug prices increased 5-fold over historical rates. And that's spurred by several reasons, but some of them are the launch of new hepatitis C medications, new cancer agents, new chemotherapy agents, each of which were launched in 2014 and 15 and 16, and really have spurred public attention on this issue. The government is projecting, let's go to the next slide. So historically, prescription drug growth has remained relatively in line with overall healthcare trends, but the recent drug launches have spurred increased prescription drug price growth in 2014 and 2015. You see the sharp spike there relative to the rest of healthcare spending. And I think that's one of the reasons that's we're talking about this and that we're getting so much public attention on the issue. And the government is projecting that those price increases and the spending on drugs are going to go back in line with historical trends. Obviously something that will depend greatly on the pharmaceutical innovation pipeline. But I also want to be able to set this in context. So if you take a look at the next slide, we do need to remember that prescription drugs remain just a small portion of overall healthcare costs. Hospital care, physician services continue to take up about 60% of overall spending. Drugs constitute about 10% when looking at only products prescribed through the retail setting. If we look at all prescription drugs, it's up around 13% annually. So I think today, as we hear our panelists talk, we'll need to remember both sides of this coin, both the sharp increases in costs that we've seen in the last couple of years, but also remember where drugs fit as a portion of overall spending. That said, I think we can't deny the fact that pharmaceutical innovation has really driven tremendous advances in healthcare in the past decades. We've seen decreases in mortality, we've seen increased tolerance, fewer side effect profiles, drugs that are easier to administer. We've seen treatments and cures for conditions where there used to be no such treatments. And yet we're still continuing to hear from payers and providers that the cost of those treatments are putting extreme pressure on their budgets, on their finances. And as a society, we're struggling to think about how to manage those costs. So as we embark on our discussion today, I'm going to leave you with sort of one final thought. As you hear some of the arguments that we're going to discuss, think about a couple of different types of drugs that we've got. So one sort of drugs are chronic medications. These are drugs used to treat diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, drugs that people following a diagnosis tend to take for the rest of their lives. And the costs associated with them accrue for the rest of their lives. And that needs a sort of special understanding and thought about how to pay for those products. Then we've got curative therapies, therapies that we need to invest up front to pay for the treatment, which can then reduce costs and save money in the long run. A little bit of a different financing mechanism that we may want to think about for how to absorb the cost of those products. And then we've got a third class of drugs, orphan therapies. Orphan therapies are drugs that treat very small diseases with very few patients and have typically had much higher costs as a result of the very small return that's expected based on the volume of scripts that we're ever going to see for those drugs. 3 very different types of drugs that may call for different solutions, and we may come back to that as we start our discussion. But I want to get into our panel. I'd like to introduce our panelists today. I'm very excited to have this group of highly opinionated and well-respected thought leaders in the field. On my right, Mr. Gregg Alton. He's the Executive Vice President of Corporate and Medical Affairs at Gilead Sciences. He's been there since 1999. He oversees the medical affairs, public affairs, and emerging markets for Gilead. Next to him, Dr. Peter Bach. He's the director for the Center of Health Outcomes and Policy at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, where he focuses on prescription drug costs and leads efforts to develop new models for drug pricing, particularly focused on patient value. On my left, Tony Beretta, Senior Vice President of Government Relations at Kaiser Permanente. Tony oversees Kaiser's legislative and regulatory policy efforts, including developing their policy positions. And on the end, Dr. Roy Beveridge, he's the Chief Medical Officer for Humana, where he develops and implements the company's clinical strategy. So welcome. So there may be lots of concerns about drug prices that we could start with. I'd like to start on an optimistic note. So I'd like to actually open up to each of you and hear a little bit about what are you optimistic about in the realm of drug development, and what do you see that promises to both improve care for individuals and lower costs for the system? Greg, we'll start with you.
So thank you. So I'll start with hepatitis C, and that's why I'm optimistic. So to answer the question, can we afford cures? Absolutely, and I think we are affording a cure for hepatitis C. I think this is an example of how the system should work. I think you had a tremendous amount of innovation over 20 years. Lots of companies working on cures for hepatitis C. You know, we estimate that at the time Sovaldi was launched, about $50 billion invested. And when we now have great compounds to treat hepatitis C, not just from Gilead, but from AbbVie, from Merck, from J&J, a variety of compounds. And what we've seen in the system, while it was, I would say, at best a shaky start, it was a rough start, we've seen competition occur in the system. We've seen prices come down, equivalent to what the single-payer systems are paying. And we're seeing broad access right now in the United States. Virtually all the payers have unrestricted access to hepatitis C. On the private side, Medicare has unrestricted access, the VA has unrestricted access, and the area we need to focus on is Medicaid. And I think there is a funding problem with Medicaid and their ability to make that upfront investment for the long-term benefits. But it is a success story in the United States right now. For example, the VA population, about 25% of that population has been cured already. So they are projecting they will be hepatitis C free by 2020. You can't say that about a lot of diseases. You know, overall, we estimate in the United States population in general, probably about 10% of the population has been cured since launch. And that is a number that's increasing dramatically every month. So we're seeing the patients. So we're optimistic. We think this is a great model, and we're hopeful to do that. We're investing in HIV cures, hepatitis B cures. We're looking at curing NASH, which is another disease of the liver. So we're hopeful that we'll have the same success as we move forward, and as will others.
Great. Peter.
You didn't warn me there'd be an optimism question. I'm not really prepared.
We're going to push you outside your box.
Yes, exactly. Can I pass on the? No, there's a tremendous amount to be optimistic about. I work at a cancer center. We've seen transformational cures and treatments come along the line. The space of immunotherapies is extremely exciting. The further atomization of cancers based on genotypic features of them into what people often call personalized medicine or targeted therapies. It's all incredibly exciting. It all sort of started, I think, with Gleevec and this idea that if we figured out the molecular alterations in a cancer and they could be targeted, that you could substantially alter the disease and what was going to happen to patients. So it's an incredibly exciting time, as you've noted. It is also, and I'm actually optimistic because we are finally discussing the challenges that high drug prices are causing in terms of access. And so all of the optimism is a little bit counterbalanced by the fact that patients with serious conditions are unable to afford medications that have been produced for them and discovered through science and through the efforts of patients volunteering for trials. So optimism, because I think we will figure out a solution where we balance these important societal and health benefits against the financial needs of companies developing them and the research enterprise. But we're not there right now.
Okay. Tony?
Yeah, no, I agree that there's a tremendous amount of optimism to be had on the subject. There's as you've described, there's wonderful therapies coming forward. It's all very important. And like Peter, I'm optimistic that we have now engaged a conversation about how we can ensure that there will be a sustainable and stable platform for innovation that's balanced with providing access appropriately. We're not there yet, but we're having that conversation now. So hopefully we'll continue having discussions like this, informed by data, informed by explanations of how we got to where we got right now, where we fundamentally have have a market that is not working well and a regulatory structure that was built over the last 25 or 35 years that didn't anticipate a situation where we would have many, many new therapies coming forward simultaneously with a fundamentally different pricing model for the patients who are going to be treated, instead of the old model of blockbusters, which were reasonably inexpensive for huge populations. Now we have very high prices for growing populations. And this is a solvable problem. I haven't seen proposals yet to get there, but our physicians in our organization are very excited about the new therapies coming forward so that we can make them available for our members and improve health over time.
Great. All right.
So I'm an oncologist. I treated patients in Northern Virginia for 22 years. So I have two things that I think make me very excited. One, from when I started training to when I finished seeing patients a few years ago, all of the science is remarkable. So I agree with everything that's been said. I concur with the concerns about affordability. I think this is a big problem, but we're not allowed to say that yet. The other thing that I'm very excited about is the way that the payment system is changing in the United States. So if you looked at the slide that was up, we saw 50 or 60% of the payment structure was around physicians and hospitals. All of those folks, plus pretty much everyone in nursing care and a lot of all the others, are moving into value-based relations, meaning that they take responsibility for the promise that they're making in terms of the care of the patient. So it's a very large proportion of the structure which is very rapidly moving right now into this value or to this responsibility system.
Well, you've set me up well. If we're going to end with there on value, I might as well turn it back to Peter. Peter, you've taken the ownership over the value definition to some extent. Memorial Sloan Kettering put out a value framework. Can you tell us a little, it's one of many, I should note, or one of several. Can you tell us a little bit about the purpose of the value framework, what goes into that, so that we can begin to have this conversation about what does value mean for these products?
Yeah, absolutely. So a little bit of background. It's the theory is that, given that the regular market mechanisms for finding prices for drugs has been intentionally broken, and that's intent in a positive sense, because of the granting of monopoly rights, patents, intellectual property rights, things that need to be given to the pharmaceutical industry to allow innovation to happen. Once it's been broken intentionally, you need some other force to find appropriate price. And the idea of value frameworks, and I'll explain what that is, but it's basically some mathematical approach to finding what the price of a product should be. The idea is to put in place a substitute price for a drug that normally the market would find by itself based on the value of a product and the benefits it goes to consumers. But we don't have any of those things in healthcare because governments pay, mandatory coverage and things like that break the market on that end. And entry of competitors is challenging when there's IP protection and things like that. So value frameworks attempt to take products, drugs, treatments, and find their price based on things that matter collectively. That, how much health benefit does a drug produce? How rare a disease does it target? Because we do skew to treating rare diseases and are willing to pay more per unit of health benefit for them. How much of a scientific advance do things constitute? So that we can incentivize, can we essentially draw a target around innovation aiming at the things that we collectively care about. So we developed one, it's called Drug Abacus. It's at drugabacus.org. It's so cool that I get to be a person who says a website that nobody writes down. But ASCO, the Clinical Oncology Society, has a value framework as well. European Society for Medical Oncology has a value framework. American College of Cardiology, and also the NCCN, which is a consortium of a bunch of cancer centers, one of which is us. All have laid out these frameworks. They're, if you will, different dialects of the same language, all around things like benefit and population size and clinical efficacy and toxicity, all in an attempt to find what prices should be based on the premise, or I think arguably the fact, that current prices are rising much faster than benefits, and that's a sign that we sort of need a temporizing force. And can I show slide 1?
Slide 1. Can we pull up slide 1?
Yep, we got it. So this is, if you will, the data on this. This is a graph from an econ journal, a paper I was involved in, showing the price of cancer drugs, all normalized for inflation, but in a very special way. They're showing how much health the drug buys based on its price and the survival gain it provides. And what you see there is over the last 20 years, the cost of a year of life in cancer has risen from about $50,000 to about $250,000 as you look at each new market entrant. And this is why I say we sort of have this fact we have to cope with, which is that whatever the number is, it's going up. And we see this in other sectors as well.
Gregg, Peter's asserting that there is a broken market that doesn't properly assess value of products. How do you think about the price of drugs relative to value and how the market is currently set up to work?
So I think that it's hard to generalize completely across all therapeutic areas and all products, and so I can only really comment on the products that we work on, really. But I think that, first of all, in terms of value, there is a challenge in defining what we mean when we say value. And I think it's great that we're having the conversation, and there's more conversations occurring everywhere. Is it value to the patients? And that's really what we focus on most. What do the patients want? And I think it's great for this conversation because if you ask anybody who has a chronic disease, they want to be cured. They want to be healthy. They don't want to be suppressed. They don't want to have longer survival times. They don't want to have their symptoms alleviated. They want to be cured. They want to be healthy. So that to us is a huge value. But then we do need to look at other components of value such as healthcare savings, comparative cost. There's a lot of different ways you can look at this. When you look at a cure, I think one of the big challenges that we've had, I'm going to put up a slide now. If you can put up slide 7, please. So this is the cost per cure of hepatitis C starting back when pegylated interferon and ribavirin was first out there. This is cost per cure, not cost of therapy. Because in hepatitis C or in any cure, the only outcome you want is a cure. It doesn't, and so you can see actually the cost per cure has come down quite a bit, largely due to new products coming out and competition for curing hepatitis C. The line on there, the red line is NICE, the National Institutes of Clinical Effectiveness. We're now below, on average in the US, where NICE actually finds the value of curing hepatitis C. The challenge, the reason I want to draw this out, the challenge in cures, and Caroline, you pointed this out, is that unlike most disease areas where you pay monthly or over time, this is all borne all up front, all at once. And that has put a huge strain on the healthcare budgets in a very short period of time. And I will say that in the U.S., hats off to the gentleman on the far left over here. A lot of the private plans have actually gotten their arms around this. They've negotiated the rates or the cost of the drug, but they've also managed to get this in their budget where it really wasn't before. But we are having challenges with the Medicaid programs and others to make that upfront investment, even where you do have that value.
Okay, Tony, what about this notion of it's a curative therapy, you've got to invest up front in order to achieve savings and better health down the line?
No, I think it's it is a great framework, and it's true that the prices have come down here. And I agree as well that a cure has particular value relative to chronic treatment of disease over time. I think one of the biggest risks, and something that doesn't show up on this slide, is when you think about the cost per cure, when you start looking at it from a population standpoint, at the left end of that slide, there were relatively few patients being treated because of the onerous nature of the therapy. And so, as Peter said, now we have, and as Gregg said, a set of really excellent products that are available for patients. The question is, how are we going to use them? If we're going to use them to cure people, what's the best way to go about making that happen? The case of hepatitis C is interesting because of the historic ways it was being managed by the medical system. In essence, we're treating as many people as we can with the army of physicians who are trained to treat patients with hepatitis C, and that's the limiting factor around how much this is why it's going to take longer than we might hope for this therapy to go through. But we're investing in something that has already been developed, which is turning out to be a great business for for Gregg and the team who are selling it, which is fine, and we want to make sure that they're successful around this. There are other investments that need to be made to get the full value out of this, which also includes training caregivers to figure out how to treat more patients. To do that, you have to look at the global cost of treatment and how you're going to invest in resources to try to get the patients treated as quickly as possible. This is an interesting area. A huge proportion of the patient population is the responsibility of the public sector. Gregg's mentioned the Medicaid program. A large proportion of patients with this therapy are incarcerated. And there's a question about whether we want to go about treating this as a public health problem or as an ongoing business that should last over a certain period of time to meet certain financial targets. Now, those things have to work together, but they're both valid concerns that need to be brought together to make sure that fiscally it works to get the care provided and ensure that there's a balanced way to ensure there's a continuing flow of money to incent innovation. Because at the end of the day, we don't want to just look at this in its own silo. We want to make sure that it makes sense for the system as a whole. But by the same token, I think things are out of balance in this particular instance insofar as the model, it's starting to call questions about the model of developing and bringing drugs to market, how that's paid for, how that operates in terms of large organizations buying smaller organizations, and what that pricing looks like. So I think the real issue is how do we look at these things as a whole to make sure that the patients who need the care can get it as effectively and quickly as possible. And that requires going beyond the way we've been looking at this.
So I want to push you a little bit because
Sure.
I would argue that actually the reason that we had very few patients being treated and now more patients being treated, sure, there was a dearth of caregivers, but now that we've got interferon-free therapies, we maybe don't need the same specialized caregivers to manage that treatment. And similarly, those treatments are more tolerable, so it is more reasonable to treat patients early who have less disease progression.
And that is true. And the other issue is, how do you do this in an orderly fashion? How do you monitor these patients appropriately? They are very good drugs. They still need to be monitored. It still requires a set of clinical expertise. The earlier therapies were limited, not just, they didn't work as well, nearly as well, and they were very onerous. So it was a legitimate clinical choice to reserve therapy until a patient started exhibiting, liver problems.
Right.
And so we don't have that now. The
Right.
question is, how do we figure out how we're going to treat a much larger population in a way that the public sector can afford it, and in a way that when it starts hitting private coverage budgets, it doesn't drive premiums higher and higher. This is one example. If you start applying this case to other therapies that are coming on and you start stacking them up on top of each other, you start when you stop looking at them as individual cases, there's reason to start worrying about whether affordability will severely be impacted over time.
So this is a major topic right now. So I talked about health economic issues, and this slide shows it. And I want to call up another slide just so I don't have to look at this slide any longer, but I won't.
Let's just go back to the
it's
session
okay.
title.
Okay, no, I'm kidding.
We'll keep peace on the panel.
This slide shows success, and that's terrific. And what Tony's talking about is that a lot of people in health econ are now asking these questions, right? I was talking about life years, and I showed life years there. And Gregg showed a similar metric of health gain, cost per unit of X, right, in this case. So his slide and mine are actually quite similar in terms of how they're denominated. But there's this other issue about budgetary impact, that you can get to sizes of populations and prices where it's crushing to actually pay for a therapy that we want. And I actually think, that's the story of the Hep C launch, really. And it's not, as Gregg pointed out, the private insurers have figured out now how to pass through the extra cost to premiums, to payers, to taxpayers, and that so it sort of gets subsumed under that larger bubble, but it's why spending on prescription drugs has risen faster than spending on any other sector of healthcare for 3 years in a row. And I'll point out that, the slide we saw with the blip in prescription drugs that then flattens out, I'll take the other side of that bet. If you look at that same slide from 5 years ago, there was no blip. All right, so we don't know what's going to happen in the future, but current behavior may or may not be a predictor of future faster growth. But I think that's this budgetary issue is one we do have to contemplate, and I think that's what Tony's saying, that ultimately we're at a situation of trade-offs. And so I think that's the pressure point.
Yeah, Roy.
So from a payer standpoint, we take care of, in Medicare Advantage, millions of people in a population way. We spend billions of dollars on our pharmacy costs. In the next 18 to 20 months, we're going to spend 50% of our drug budget just on specialty drugs that will be consumed by 1.3% of our membership. That's a shocking number. And so what this means is that 98.7% of the population are essentially using generic drugs and very reasonably priced drugs to take care of the large number of chronic diseases that is the major driver in our healthcare budget. Because yes, going back to slide 4, it's hospitals and everything else like this, but the major driver of our costs is chronic disease at this point. It's old age, it's dementia, it's congestive heart failure, it's diabetes, it's old age. And so this change in proportion in terms of cost is something which is crucially important. It gets to your point. What we've found to be successful is working with all the different facets of the system for people to begin to take responsibility. In terms of physicians are now going to be paid based on results. Hospitals now are paid based on results and will increasingly be compensated as such. Nursing home, physical therapists, all these other folks are paid based on results. And so I think all this is great, but where I see all this going is how do we as a society begin to deal with the innovation? Because what you've got are great drugs, there's no question. But there are a number of drugs out there that are less great. And so how are we going to pay for that? And I think part of this is putting the world of pharmaceuticals, et cetera, in the same grouping as all the rest of the medical system in terms of taking responsibility, in terms of if you say this is what your drug is going to do, then from a population standpoint, let's make sure it does. But that's I think, how the payers are thinking about things.
So how do we do this, right? How do we begin to inject those market-based solutions and this sense of paying for value into the way that we pay for drugs?
There's a big problem that exists in terms of how the market is regulated, how pricing is regulated. We actually, the market really is broken, and there is no free market for prescription drug prices. For many years, because of the way government programs and the private market work together, there's been essentially a floor on pricing. And so it's very difficult. There's two things. One is it's difficult to negotiate prices down. You can, in many cases, do that at some point to get to the point at which the seller is willing to sell it to the government entities that are eligible for the same pricing. But there's a problem. The issue, though, is virtually all of those negotiations key off of the initial launch price that the manufacturer sets. And even when new manufacturers come in with alternative competing drugs, they tend to set the price at pretty much the exact same price. So it's that process of launch pricing is important. It's not, and that's what some of Peter's research goes to show, which is that these launch prices have been systematically ratcheting up year over year, particularly in the oncology space, but in other areas as well. And so what we have to do, as we're saying, we have to get away from this per unit kind of sales that are going on and instead look for outcomes. The current regulatory structure really won't permit that. So there's going to have to be a way of looking at how the market's working, in the US, we're going to need to have conversations. Those of us who are buying the drugs and those who are selling the drugs, we have to work together to figure out how we can go to the government and offer new models on how we can try to do these types of things. But under the current regulatory scheme, it's pretty restricted.
So Tony's mentioning launch prices, although certainly we should acknowledge that most health plans aren't actually paying launch price, right? There are negotiations happening here and rebates being paid by the manufacturers. Peter, how do we make our way out of this?
Well, it's difficult, right? So it's about a $400 billion market in the U.S., and it reminds me, my wife used to go shopping at Barney's when there were sales, and she'd come home laden with bags. She always looked great, by the way, and she'd say, I saved, $1,100. And I would say, you know nothing about prescription drugs, but that's what we hear every day in that space too, right? There's this list price, and then fortunate or unfortunate, probably fortunate for the players in the system, unfortunate for patients trying to get care in the system, the chain of transactions that go from a pill leaving the end of a manufacturing line to a patient's home includes a number of intermediaries who are largely paid off of proportion to that list price. So rebates, add-ons, markups by physicians and hospitals for physician-administered drugs, pharmacy dispensing fees, a lot of these other indirect and circular rebates and things like that, these are all proportional to the price. So like any other industry with a complicated distribution chain, sort of everyone at the margin wants a better deal, but everyone wants the mean spend to go up, right? So they're happy to compete around the margin, but they just all get richer, or they just do better by the pie getting larger. So this is a huge problem, and now, as to some extent, the way insurers have responded to rising prices, particularly for drugs, is to peel back coverage. And so fine, the price is there, but there's this high deductible thing, and you have to pay out of pocket, and then when you do show up to get your prescription, you're going to get paid 25% of this, and all these things, these co-insurance, these percentage numbers are different from the old days where you'd go in and it was flat fee. It was $5 or $10 or $1 or free. And once you have insurance that is percentage based, you have this challenge of like, well, percentage of what? And many times patients are coming in and they show up at their pharmacy, and that 25% is calculated from that list price. And so as this dollars and discounts and rebates and paybacks and volume-based rebates and things like that percolate through, they don't touch the patient. And so a patient will pay 25% of that original list price, blow through their donut hole, blow through their deductible. If they're in a Part D plan in Medicare, they face in a standard benefit package 5% of how much they spend forever. And Gregg's company's products are a perfect example, but there's lots of other pills in oncology too, where even though it's, the company's been very clear about the discounts that are available, they are system-level discounts. If you go in to get a prescription of, Sovaldi or Harvoni or something like that, and you're a Part D beneficiary, that 25% or that deductible you pay, that's essentially off of whack, right? This list price, the price my wife alleged somebody else was paying. But in fact, there's nobody really paying it except the patient.
Or the patient who has no insurance.
Well, we always soak the poor, right? We always
Correct.
soak the uninsured. That's
Right.
our solution. Yep.
I mean, I think the points are good, and the complexity of the market doesn't serve consumer purposes as well as it could. And it's, in defense of how things have operated, it is, as Peter said before, as the pricing has gone up, it's just increased the economics overall. So we've seen this migration to higher deductibles and higher cost sharing, and that's frankly driven by the higher pricing that's going on because the employers or other individuals who are competing to offer products on premium, there's premium competition as well. There's only so much that can be put in a premium. The rest of it, unfortunately, winds up being in cost sharing or in uncovered benefits, essentially. And nobody really likes that. At Kaiser Permanente, I mean, historically, we've had very comprehensive drug benefits. We've had very rich drug benefits. There's been a strong preference for flat co-payments as opposed to co-insurance, although we do have some co-insurance products as well. But because of the way we've been organized, we've always and are strong proponents of excellent access to pharmaceutical therapy. We've always tried to have as rich coverage as possible. And what we're seeing is that pricing is driving it harder and harder to maintain comprehensive coverage. And because of the growth, particularly in some of the exchange products and others, where the metal tier plans, which automatically start with a kind of deductible model, you're seeing more and more fall out of this as the actuaries have to work out where the money goes to premium or to cost sharing. So I do think that it's not exactly true that the consumers and the system as a whole have misaligned incentives. I think there's a desire for whether it is a market force or some other force on what happens with pricing, it's not there now in a way that we would hope to see it, which gets me back to the problem of the market basically being broken. I do think that when you look at how the launch prices, and for example, on the hepatitis C drugs, the launch prices were being used for a while, until alternative products started coming into the market. And yes, at that point, there started to be competitive pressure that started bringing the prices down. But the fact is, even that competition, as Peter said, was off of those launch prices in the first instance. What's not clear to me is how, and I think it's great that Peter's doing the work that he's doing. There are others trying to figure out value-based pricing so that we can get ahead of simply the party selling the drug figures out what price it wants to sell on whatever philosophical basis it has to set that price. There needs to be dialogue before that to understand how we can actually get the value out of these products, make sure that it fits with the rest of the system, make sure that patients have access the way they need it. But it needs to happen up front.
Yes, Roy.
So as we as society move into accountable care organizations, population health, the problem is we've got to be taking care of, to your point, large groups of people. And so if you're Humana, for instance, we give, and it's the same thing with lots of other payers, we're very comfortable charging no copays, no deductibles, nothing for generic drugs or for non-specialty drugs, because if 90 or 95 or 99 out of 100 people are taking those medicines for their congestive heart failure and their blood pressure and their diabetes, then this is good for a very large number of people. It gets back to that 1.3% of people with these costs that are just spiraling. And so I think that's my concern.
But as the patient with one of those specialty diseases
Yep.
who needs treatment and cures on a daily basis, what difference does it make to them that you're covering the,
So let's take
drugs for the masses?
let's take the hepatitis C example. Your drugs, that whole class is really good, and the reason that the private payers could bring that into their premiums was because it was so clear that it's a good treatment, that everyone was willing to pay for it very quickly. Therefore, the actuaries could figure out what the costs were going to be, as painful as it was the first year and a half, just
For
so
all
we're
of us.
clear. But after that, we knew what the number of people with hepatitis C coming in, we could build that into the premiums. That all makes sense. It's so many of these drugs that are on the margin where it's not clear that it's a cure. And a lot of the drugs that are being approved, particularly in my field of oncology, a lot of them are Me Too drugs, and a lot of them are okay. But they're not the high quality cure type things that you're talking about.
Wait, can I say something? Yes. All right, so I hesitate to disagree with my friend Roy on a couple of points, but one is what Roy just described is called insurance. right? A whole bunch of people pay in and a few people make claims, right? And that's what's happening with specialty drugs, right? And way back when we had health, we used to call it health insurance, and it was supposed to be like that. We've monkeyed with it in lots of ways that are troubling, but at the end of the day, the reason everyone pays premiums is so that the one person or the few people who are the victims of random events or even victims of their own happenstance or their own lifestyle choices have protection to pay for high-cost things, right? Like just like fire, you know, not every house doesn't burn down every year, but everyone pays in for fire insurance for the same reason, right? But I think we have to, the broader issue is the relative dissociation between the prices of things and sort of how they fit into this broader context of what we want to be able to afford long term. So let me make this point. Slide 3, if we can put it up. So this looks exactly like Gregg's slide except upside down. Yeah. Okay,
you could superimpose mine on there.
I could, yes. Well, one goes up, the other goes down. And the blue one is going up. It's the cost of Gleevec, the same tablet it's always been since 2005 with that reformulation in the US, the price of, I think it's a week of therapy there, compared to the cost for a gigahertz from an iPhone with a contract.
I think that's yeah, right.
Right, so over time. And it's a completely unfair comparison because we have a competitive market for cell phones. We have societal benefits from cell phones that vastly exceed the value that they provide to each of us, right? Probably most of us are paying $60, $70 a month or something like that for a phone. I'm sure the economic value of that phone is much greater to most of us than that. The price of Gleevec has risen 3x over that same time period with no technological advance, if you will. It's fallen by about 15% in France during that time period, starting from a lower baseline. But leaving that aside, right, this is an example of what's really the challenge, right? So you talk about cures, Roy. Caroline, you mentioned this sort of recouping of cost savings because of cures and things like that. But the real question is, how is a market, and Tony asserted the market is broken. What does that mean? And to me it means sort of Adam Smith. Like, what's a market supposed to do? And it's supposed to, through the narrow self-interest of all of the players, create societal benefit. Because everyone is pursuing profits and their own gains. And what you have is firms entering and producing products that people greatly value more than the firms are able to charge for it, right? And if Apple could extract the value of the iPhone from all of us, they would be doing so, but they can't because of Samsung or whatever, or BlackBerry. So it's going to be worth a fortune on eBay someday. So this is the difference, right? So Gleevec, which is not Gregg's product, so I can get the heat off of him here for a second, but you know, the company is extracting all the societal value for itself, which is not what happens in a market. What happens in a market is what's happening with the iPhone, which is that every year you spend $1, you get more than you got last year, and you pay much less than it's worth to you.
Now, Peter, if I could, Caroline, that graph doesn't actually tell the whole story either, because the patient
basically everything is on that graph.
No, but well, I'm going to say it's worse than that, because what happened over that time was the patient population expanded significantly, right?
Well, that's a budgetary issue, right? So that's the other domain, absolutely.
So what's interesting about that, and this goes to the buckets that you talked about earlier, in terms of cures and orphan drugs and traditional drugs and all of this. What I really see as the problem here is there's drifting in and out of lanes over pricing theory in these different buckets. And the biggest thing that I think is of concern is when you have orphan drug type pricing applied to diseases with potentially large populations. And that's where we're seeing, and you know, I don't want to pick on the hepatitis C case too much, but this was a massively expanded market. And yet the pricing was tied seemingly originally to traditional modes of treating these patients for a fraction. So that graph, my only point is, you would think in a market, or maybe this is the wrong way to think about it, but there were many, many more patients able to be treated with this drug, and yet the price kept going up and up and up, despite no additional real innovation going on there.
Yeah.
There was some research done, but it
So I actually do want to continue to pick on hepatitis C for a moment, because I think we've got a unique situation where both of the health plans on the panel have acknowledged that these are great drugs, right? And have in fact acknowledged that they're good enough drugs that it made sense, despite initial pain on all accounts, to incorporate them into the premium for insured individuals. There's a new Health Affairs May edition that came out just a couple hours ago, I guess. And in it, there's a piece arguing for government use patent rights. Not Marchin, government use of the patent, but very close. Legal arguments here, right? That the government should come in, permit generic production of hepatitis C medications, and pay royalties far less than would be market value to the manufacturers who hold the current patents for the good of the society. So, I think it gets to the crux of this issue, which is everyone seems to acknowledge these are great drugs, and yet still, right, we're not on the margins of drugs that have a small benefit. Even with the good benefit, we're having sort of pain over the price point. So, Gregg, help us here.
Did you read the article that just came out?
I didn't know. This is the second time I've been
Spring
on
on
panel
you.
sprung with an article. But I mean, whether it's Marchin rights or something else, I mean, I think that there's still, the hepatitis C story. I think it's start off, with a $1,000 pill, a lot of really negative stuff, and as you showed earlier, a lot of press on that. But it's part of a bigger debate right now. You had the Valiants, and you had the Turings, and you've had, price increases that you showed here. I think that's in the public domain right now a lot. And so I still think that we're going to have a lot of people questioning the pricing and really not looking at, I think, some of the rational conversations that we're having here. So in this case, I don't know how to respond to that other than, this wasn't developed by NIH, as some people have said out there. It was not developed by the VA, as some have said out there. So I don't know what the basis of that would be.
Well, but I think to this sort of notion that we're hearing that the pricing system that you get to set prices where you want.
Well, people look at that because they talk about patents having monopoly. I've heard that's said a few times here, and it creates a marketplace that is skewed. But for our industry, we actually start with the competition starts in R&D, not in the marketplace. So in terms of when we started with hepatitis C, we were one of 200 companies working on cures for hepatitis C. That's where the competition starts. And I think this is a bit of a unique story because you do have now multiple companies coming out with products. We do have a competitive marketplace in hepatitis C. But when you talk about competition, it's not just the market, it's actually being able to develop those innovative therapies. We'd love to have a competitive product for Gleevec. That would be fantastic, but we don't. If I may, since I've been quiet for a while, I think that hepatitis C is unique, and we have to be careful when we talk about hepatitis C and the success, I think, that we are seeing with this. First of all, it is rare that you're going to get a cure of 95 to 100% for a disease. And we do have that, and we're seeing that in real life. So the outcomes are actually very hard to dispute in hepatitis C. The other thing, while we do have a large patient population that Tony and others have referred to, it is a population that has built up over 20 or 30 years for lack of treatment. It's not like this is a huge patient population that just came yesterday. So once we actually start treating these patients, we will see the number of infected individuals going down greatly. You won't always get that in other diseases. When we talk about Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, these are diseases that we're going to continue to see. It's not an infectious disease that we can wipe out like hepatitis C. So I think that makes a big difference in the conversations we have. That being said, yes, it is a large population, and I think that the lessons that we get from hepatitis C, and we have to be careful of not extrapolating, is how we look at the value of a cure, how we fund the value of a cure, because it was initially quite a challenge. But we're just hopeful we'll have more of those and more competition for diseases and for cures.
Great. I want to bring the audience into it. We've got a little bit of time left. Let's take a question here in the front row.
Thanks. When you think about payment systems, the question is who is going to decide, right? So let's say it is Alzheimer's, and a company thinks it's easily worth $15,000 a year, and you think, well, we can't handle that in our system. So is it going to be decided amongst you? And if you can't come to a decision, what's next? Thanks.
Well, I mean, I think, the current system does leave most pricing control in the hands of the industry. And then I think, most of the rationalization for that pricing is, back factored, if you will, from the price, right? So like once you have the price, like, well, then it's according to this or that. And you know, the challenge is that the buyers, if it's government or government regulated in the private insurance market, you know, have limited options if drugs are highly effective. And so, you know, the idea of these value frameworks is to, you know, and ours, for example, is to have some sort of third party that could come to appropriate prices that would be optional, but that would clear the market, you know, to sort of the benefit of society. And so if there were a value-based price for some of these cancer drugs, you know, we would expect that insurers would no longer create barriers for patients getting them, right? Gleevec, on this slide, there's patients paying, you know, out of pocket for that drug. This is a very important drug for cancer. There's never a justification for that, but paying hundreds or thousands of dollars. And what they do is they stop taking the pill, right? One of the most effective treatments we have in cancer. So the idea is if you get to these right prices from some sort of process, then manufacturers get benefits from taking those prices, like access to insurance markets. Patients get benefits like no barriers from copays and co-insurance. And there's other sorts of more technical kinds of benefits like exemption from Medicaid best price and exclusion from 340B and other sorts of stuff, which would make the market work more efficiently.
Right.
So I think one way to think about this is that an increasing number of individuals are choosing their health care. So it's not just in Medicare Advantage plans, but it's now also in all the public exchanges. People choose the middle tier, they're choosing the company they want to work with and the amount that they want to spend. And to answer part of your question, I think if someone rolled out a drug that was $15,000 that had no benefit, and we put this on our plan, then the people who choose us or not choose us as representatives of their health care, they're not going to choose us. So I think we need, and I think we're going to continue to see more pressure from consumers who will be looking at the prices that they're willing to spend for treatments.
I'm sorry, I have the microphone.
Ah,
Then you ask your question.
you have the floor.
There was some talk about physicians now becoming more accountable for the outcomes of a patient through the development of their accountable care organizations. Don't you still agree that the payer still has a certain level of control? So you've got the physician that's responsible for the total outcomes, but they have very little control over what drugs are available to them on their formulary. That's dictated by the payer. Right, so you gave the example of Humana now, in some cases, providing drugs at a zero copay. If, let's use hypertension or diabetes, where you've got large populations and a large number of generic options. If the payer has incentivized the physician through zero copays or through other incentives, or the threat of being penalized for using too much of the branded product, isn't this physician, even in an accountable care environment, basically steered towards a generic product which may not necessarily be the most effective because this particular developer, this manufacturer's come up with another product that maybe is just a once-a-week product and is actually shown to have better outcomes. But from a financial standpoint, it's still to the benefit of the payer to still go with the generic one. And through that payer-type incentive system, the physician's behavior is impacted accordingly.
So this shows the paradox between the fee-for-service system and the value system, MACRA, MIPS, ACOs, everything else that we're talking about. In this new model that we're all moving to at a very fast clip, then because the physician and the care organization becomes accountable, becomes responsible, then they are the ones who are globally looking at what they wish to treat their population with. And so I think your concern about the old days of Mother May I in fee-for-service, it absolutely makes clear why we need to move into this value world from a physician and a care standpoint.
If I may, I can actually throw a favor back this way. I mean, in the conversations that we have with payers around coverage and looking to expand the coverage and be on a preferred formulary, it's not just price. they do care about the data. They really want to understand the product. They want to see real-world outcomes. They want to see the safety profile. So I don't think what we're seeing right now is a situation where the payers are simply saying we're going to use the cheapest drug in every case. They really want to find the best drug for their patients. So then it's our burden to actually produce that data. And it's our burden to continue to develop the product and really define the best use of that product for the patient population. So it's not perfect, but I think that they truly want to do that.
Let's take one more question. The surprise mic.
You need a mic.
Thank you. So what I've heard from the panel is that as we move towards a value-based payment system, in the same way that we have created sort of a breakthrough model in the R&D side, we need a breakthrough type of financing to support and differentiate products such as the hepatitis C cures that do provide high value and differentiate from those from other drugs that may not provide as much value. I want to ask Dr. Bach, in his value framework, how have patients and patient advocates and patient advocacy organizations been involved in the definitions of that value? And what you see is the wisdom of CMS moving to select perhaps one single value framework that may or may not include patients in the formulation of the criteria and execution of that.
Yeah, so there's several questions in there, right? So one is, so the value framework I developed did not involve patients or anyone. I sat in my office and created it, which makes, it's, if you don't like committees, it's really a great work process. So it's, but it is what it is. It's the Drug Advocates is this flexible platform. You can sort of go in there and kind of input your own values and things like that about how you think an equation for pricing drugs matters or would be implemented. CMS has not announced that they're going to use a specific value framework, so I'm not sure what you're referring to per se. If you're talking about the Part B pilot, they're talking about things like reference pricing, but I haven't seen CMS. There's stuff that's come out of the Clinton campaign around value frameworks and adopting them, and from the Center for American Progress, but not from the government at all. The last thing is I want to push back a little bit, and it's come up a couple of times. This question of, do we need a financing mechanism to pay for things that have long-term benefit? And I want to challenge this, and it gets to Roy's earlier point, right? The way we pay for drugs in healthcare is unique. Every other type of service, I'm a physician, Roy's a physician, we get paid off of fee schedules. Nobody pays us, and maybe we'll eventually get paid for quality or performance. I'm less optimistic, I think, than the payers here, that this will ever really have purchase, if you will. But we get paid off of fee schedules. Hospitals are paid cost plus. Nursing homes are based essentially on their overhead and things like that. The only sector where the player sets their own prices is the drug space. And so the real question is, how have we paid for all of these cures delivered by other aspects of the healthcare system, right? So I'm a doctor. I prescribe an antibiotic. I cure somebody of pneumonia. I never got to say, well, that person now got a 20-year benefit from not having pneumonia and chronic lung disease or death. Where's my check? And if we paid hepatologists for diagnosing hep C along the same lines as we pay for the treatments for them, or the pathologist who reads the liver biopsy or anything else like that, we would have a lot of extremely happy hepatologists, some probably looking at that Bombardier jet out there, right? But that's not how we do things, right? We don't pay people based on the value of yanking out a ruptured appendix based on the healthcare value. So this argument, as I said, has been reverse engineered to justify pricing that's probably off by a factor of 10. And so we don't need a new financing model. We need a rational way to pay for treatments that benefit society and maintain innovation, not transfer wealth from public programs to a small number of companies and their shareholders.
Okay, circling back to the question at hand, actually, though, I do want to say that you asked about a patient-centered value framework. Faster Cures is a center of the Milken Institute. They've actually taken on this work. None of the existing value frameworks are patient-centered, and they are embarking this summer on a collaborative process to build a truly patient-centered value framework, so stay tuned. Let's do one final question quickly, and then we're going to return to the panelists for a last word.
A question or just a comment. I'm Pablo Legorreta. I run a company called Royal Pharma, and a lot of you. And the reality is that the topic that has been discussed, I think the framework is excellent and the comments are excellent. They're all very specific to specific cases. And I think what's also missing is the big picture, because like the comment that, we're spending, I forget the figures, 1.3 on 15, 1.3% on 15%, or what was it? It's highly distorted in a way.
Spending the most for a small number of patients.
Correct.
Yes.
And it's highly distorted because you have to take, I think, a long-term perspective, long view, and not a punctual, Lipitor was expensive years ago, and it provided huge benefit to a huge amount of people. They're now generics. So the reality is that we are going from a phase in the industry where we were using, pills that were not as expensive, treating a huge amount of patients. Now they have become generic. And what's going to happen in 10 or 15 or 20 years is the Hep C drugs and the other drugs that are being used to treat a lot of the orphan diseases will become generic, and they're going to be cheap. So looking at this long term is important. And I think the other comment that I would make is when you look at how much is spent by the whole industry in the U.S., $80 billion per year in R&D, this industry, there's no other industry that invests this amount of money in the world, $180 billion worldwide. But the U.S. companies, about 80 billion, and there's 40 drugs approved, last year. And if you look back, not as many. And you do the math, it costs between 2 billion and maybe as much as 4 billion per drug approved. So the reality is that we have to really question and try to look at this from a much more holistic perspective and over time, because if the companies are not able to make money, you won't have these treatments that are going to cure all of the diseases. And anyway, it's just, I think I just want to provide that perspective of the long term.
I actually think it's a great point, and I think it's a helpful one to bring us back for closing comments. I think that the point is, right, we want to make sure that we sustain innovation and continue to produce excellent new drugs that are going to treat disease. We've got manufacturers that are taking significant amounts of risk for a finite period of patent exclusivity and need to recapture some of that risk. And we have health insurers that, quite frankly, are balancing premium budgets on a one-year basis, not a long-term basis in many cases. So with closing comments, looking out into the next couple of years, what is the one thing that you would like to see change to really move us forward in terms of a sustainable, pro-innovation path forward? We'll go in reverse order. Roy?
Well, I'll go back and circle back. I think that as we move into accountable relations, this is how we're going to solve a number of these issues and deal with distribution, affordability, and I think there's adequate incentives in the system to allow companies to be adequately reimbursed.
Great. Tony?
Tying the question to the wrapping it up, though, I do think, at Kaiser Permanente, we do everything in the healthcare sector, from, the physician services, hospital services, pharmacy services, financing, and we do look at this over the long term. And the long-term concern is that we have a current structure of financing and development of drugs and bringing them to the market that feels out of balance when we look at the systematic ratcheting up of pricing year over year, either new launch prices or existing drugs that are on the market. And it doesn't matter which category you're talking about, the same strategies are being employed to acquire products and then price them as high as you possibly can. So I think the bigger gestalt question is, you see this in hospital systems, you see the reaction among physicians to MACRA, the ACA, and other areas. And there is a growing concern about affordability of the healthcare system as a whole. There's a growing concern that 18% of GDP is just it can't be sustained compared to everyone else. And it feels like the pharmaceutical industry really needs to get on the team with everybody else to figure out how we can work together to make comprehensive coverage much more affordable, and that's the goal.
Yeah, I'd like to, can I show slide 2? Because
everyone's going to run out the room on that prompt. So.
No, it gets...
Past time, and we do have another section coming in, so we really need to end this.
Okay, we need to break the inflationary rise in prices. And what I was going to show is Lipitor is always the example brought up. The cost for lowering LDL for a milligram for a month was $1.85 for Lipitor at the branded price. The PCSK9 inhibitors, these new drugs, it's $18, and both in today's dollars. So sure, big breakthrough, and fraction of what we're paying for the same gain in health.
Last word, Greg.
Okay. Great conversation. I agree with the comments that more and better discussion should occur because more innovation hopefully is coming. We want to have better drugs. We want to have innovative cures. We want better cures. But everyone wants affordability at the same time and want broad access. Not easy. I won't say the system's broken, but it's certainly not perfect, and there's ways to make it better. I do think focusing on what we mean by value and how we assess value is actually, to me, a obvious place to start, but won't probably fix everything, but a great place to start.
Thank you all for joining us.